Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's online talk. The topic for today is relational communication. We are excited to see so many of our clients on the line today, many of whom have read our books or attended one of our training classes, or those we've partnered with to build their mobile apps or digital products. So, if you are unfamiliar with Big Nerd Ranch, we build brilliant apps and teach others to do the same. So, to shed light on the why or importance of today's topic, I'd like to share a bit on an independent research from a credible source. The benefits of effective enterprise communication are really quite stunning. Gartner published a Watson Wyatt communication study, which shows that companies with effective communications can have higher market premiums, higher shareholder returns, levels of employee engagement, and are more likely to report turnover than organizations that do not communicate effectively. So before we get into our introduction, we're going to have an audience poll right out of the gate. So you guys get engaged here. And the first poll just simply reads, we want to know, what is the motivation behind attending today's webinar? What is going on in your organization where this is rising to the top? Whether you're looking to communicate more effectively down with your team or manage up with your leadership. Perhaps this is just a personal goal. If you're like me, I take advantage of any type of professional development opportunity I can get my hands on. And if that's the case, if you're just always looking for those type of resources. So if you could let us know that, I'd like to get it to about 60%. And yes, we are there. So I'm going to close this up. Last chance to submit your response. For this particular one, I think I'd like to share it so our presenter can see this as well. So professional development, always looking for that. That's certainly my fan. It looks like about 25 and 25 either has this as a personal goal or looking to communicate more effectively with their team. And then just under 20% are looking to communicate more effectively with their leadership team. Very interesting. All right. So I'd like to welcome today's guest presenter. I'm going to go back one. Stay. Janelle Payne is from MotivaimCoach. She's a trainer and coach. Janelle possesses an in-depth knowledge of communication and speech theory and practical application for business communication, such as formal and informal speaking, interpersonal and conflict resolution skills. She's earned consistently stellar facilitation coaching evaluations since 2012 and teaching evaluation since 2006. Janelle designs and lead courses in leadership communication, leadership presence, women leadership, influence, executive voice, and team performance. She also coaches professionals and seasoned leaders and executives on communication, presentation skills, presence, and interpersonal savvy, and is masterful at customizing the experience and engagement to meet the client's skill level and personality. So, without further delay, I am going to pass the ball over to our guest presenter. So just bear with us for a moment as we switch presentations. And Janelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate the very generous introduction. I'm thrilled to be with all of you today to talk about some best practices for cultivating a climate for collaborative problem solving. So that is what we are here to do. As mentioned, I am here on behalf of MotivaimCoach. We offer business consulting and coaching, leadership development, and we also offer team and group coaching. We are housed in the Silicon Valley, the heart of it, and we work with the biggest names in tech, and we can offer live online learning opportunities, classrooms face-to-face at our headquarters, or we can come to you, and we are just thrilled to have the opportunity to spend some time with you today. Nikki, you already said so many things that made me feel good that that I'm not gonna underscore that, but I do want to tell you a little bit of background that provides a bit of a story so that you understand how I got here. I first started studying interpersonal communication in the 90s and around 96, and I was working my way to a bachelor's degree in communication. And fast forward a couple of years, and I got my first real job outside of waiting tables at MTV, and I worked in television. And I had an executive producer who was my boss, who really had an aggressive communication style. And I remember clear as day, even though this was a long time ago, that he used to walk around our open workspace. We all sat in cubicles, and he'd walk around with an aluminum baseball bat to really set this sort of intimidating tone. And it really set all of us that were working on a team together, it really set us into an anxious mindset. And we didn't ever really know what to expect from him, because sometimes he would show a very different version of himself. Sometimes he would take this was in LA. He would take us out to lunch in Venice. And so he was very tumultuous in his communication style, and we never knew what to expect. And it really put us at unrest, I would say. And so after doing that for a little while, I thought, I'm going to go back to school, and I'm going to get a master's degree in communication, and I'm going to teach interpersonal skills, because I felt so motivated by how I didn't want people to lead their teams. So that's a little backstory on me. I'm a Bay Area native, born and raised in San Jose, and after I left TV and went back to get a graduate degree, I started teaching interpersonal communication at San Jose State, where I went and got my master's, and I'm a certified mediator through Santa Clara's dispute resolution. So it's been really interesting to grow up in the Bay Area and see how it's evolved over the years and really changed. I came across this statement the other day, and I thought, wow, this really resonates with what we're talking about today. One does not simply do an individual assignment individually. So for those of you who are on the call today, and you are engineers, some of you, many of you probably, you probably have a lot of work where you are working autonomously, but at some point you need to interact with a coworker or a peer. You need to get their feedback, or you might need to get some buy-in for a solution that you're proposing. We're always interacting with other people. We don't work in individual silos. That's just not how it works, does it? I really appreciate Nikki setting some context for the why interpersonal intelligence is so important in the workplace. And I want to share with you, just on Monday of this week, I was contacted by the head of global strategy and strategic sourcing and procurement at an e-commerce company in the Valley. And she said, Janelle, I need an executive coach for a senior manager of mine. She's been here for north of 3 years. She's a subject matter expert, super, super smart. And the consistent feedback that she's gotten from her peers, her colleagues, and even her managers is that she's a bit rough around the edges. And I said, well, tell me more about that. And she said, well, people find her very polarizing. People describe her as being very defensive and difficult to deal with. And this is just one example of many that I could share with you, and I'll share one more. 2 weeks ago, I was working with an entertainment company down in LA, and they create amazing video games. And one of the managers in the training that I was facilitating pulled me aside at one point, and he said, I know this is a little off topic, but I want your advice on something. And I said, shoot. He said, I'm managing this team, and I'm getting a lot of feedback that they're just not engaging with people. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, their head is down, they've got tunnel vision, they're working on a project, they've got deadlines, they're doing their job. But when people come up to ask them a question, or when a customer calls, they don't look up, they don't make the eye contact, or when they answer the phone, they don't have the ability to build the rapport, and the interpersonal intelligence piece is lacking. And I said, well, what's the implication of that for you? What's your concern really with that? And he said, well, it's starting to really shape not only that individual person's reputation, or what is now termed personal brand, but it's also influencing the personal brand of our company, because these people are representing us. So I share those two anecdotes with you just to paint a picture for how important it is for us to be able to work well with others. And we spend a lot of time at work. Let me just tell you. In 2014, there was a national Gallup poll that said the average American works 47 hours per week. Now, that was quite a while ago, and at that time, even some of them were saying, well, I put in 50 hours a week. So with Nikki's help, we want to facilitate a poll here. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Nikki, but we want to find out how many hours a week you're working.
Well, it is right in front of you. So you should see a blue quick poll box appear. And if you could just chime in and let us know, on average, how many hours do you spend working per week? And we are, you guys are fast. We are close to 75% complete. So last chance, and I'm going to shut it down. Would you like for me to share these, Janelle?
I would love that. Thank you.
And there you go.
Oh,
The
wow.
bulk is between 40 and 50.
Okay. Lots of time. You're putting in lots of hours. So I feel really appreciative to be with you today when you're putting so many hours in at work already. So wow, we're spending a lot of time at work. So when we are at work and we are engaging with other people, that is influencing our job satisfaction, how we feel when we're in the workplace. And if you don't believe me that matters, that really, if that environment is not healthy, and if it's not really sustaining your happiness and job satisfaction over time, if you don't believe me and you want more scientific research on this topic, I will recommend Michelle Gielin's book, Broadcasting Happiness. She is a former national CBS News anchor turned positive psychology researcher. And this book, I think, is pretty profound. And I'm going to share just a couple of quick data points with you. What her research shows, and this is from psychology and neuroscience, is that small shifts in the way we communicate with each other have big ripple effect on business and on business outcomes. So 31% higher productivity when communication in the workplace is going well, 25% better performance ratings, 37% higher sales, and 23% lower levels of stress. Now, the last one to me is really resonates, because why would we want to add to our stress? We want to work in thriving work environments, and we want to really be mindful about how we're contributing to shaping those climates that we're a part of. So what is this program all about? In the larger curriculum, the program goal goes through the 3 C's to collaborative problem solving. Today, we're going to focus really on that first bucket, which is called connection. I want to give a high-level overview of each of these for a moment, and then we're going to go deeper into connection. And you'll actually walk away with a couple of tools and best practices for how to create better connection in your workplace. So connection has to do with being connected to self, and then that influences your ability to connect with others. The second bucket is around curiosity. Let me go back for a moment. When we feel connected to people, we are better equipped and of a mindset to become more curious. And when we are curious, we learn more faster. And when we are curious, it helps us not only gain clarity for what other people's needs are and what other people are asking of us, but it helps us send clear messages to others. It helps us set clear boundaries. It helps us answer questions in a clear way. So I want to unpack this first bucket of connection. And the reason why there's the visual of the mind is that it's important that we are mindful, or in the field of communication, we call it self-aware, of our own contributions to every interaction we have with other human beings. Our self-concept is influenced by a host of variables. And I'm just gonna spitball a few of them here, but we could go on and on. Our self-concept is made up of our gender, of our age, of our generation, sexual orientation, political affiliations, occupation, socioeconomics, culture, ethnicity. I could keep going. I won't. But the self-concept is what shapes how we deal with other people and our communication style. So we really need to be in tune with who am I and what version of myself am I bringing into my interactions. I was in Vancouver, British Columbia just last week working with the 4th largest software company in the world, and I was coaching a lot of people, but there was one particular woman that I was coaching, and she shared with me, she's an engineer, and she shared with me that 130 of the employees in that office are engineers. So more than 60% of employees in her BC office are engineers, and that there is this real push for bringing mental health and mindfulness as a key topic into their culture. They're really infusing this idea of mindfulness. So what does that look like specifically? I asked her. She said, well, we're going to have quiet spaces for people to be reflective and meditate if they want. We're going to have pods where people can take a rest if they haven't had a good night's sleep, because we know that contributes to how we communicate. And she gave me some different examples. And the reason I'm sharing this is because it stopped me in my tracks a little bit, and it just made me think, you know, this is not a trend. This is not going away. These kinds of mindfulness, sort of infused best practices into the workplace, they are evolving because of the research findings from psychology, communication, neurobiology, behavioral science. We're learning so much about all of the influences of a healthy, happy workplace and a healthy, happy mind and body, and how that influences our communication on others. So I know there's a lot there, but there's so much to say here. I want to give you a little bit of context for being in connection with yourself, and that inherently is going to influence how you communicate with other people. So my colleague who facilitated a really amazing webinar on emotional intelligence, shared in more depth some research from Google. And I'm not going to go into depth here, but I'm going to give you the Cliff's Notes version. He shared that when Google conducted some original research around figuring out what makes a thriving team thrive, and it wasn't about putting together and grouping together the smartest people in the room, but it was about finding people, really what they figured out was that the groups that were thriving at Google were the ones that they all had one thing in common. And the one thing in common was that they all established what is termed psychological safety with one another. Well, what does that mean? Psychological safety is the ability to contribute your ideas without feeling like you're going to be hindered or cut off or dismissed. It's the ability to challenge the status quo. It's and feel vulnerable enough to ask questions, even if they feel like silly questions. That's psychological safety. This concept has evolved from Abraham Maslow's theory called the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And some of you might be familiar with this, like you saw it back at university in a psych or a sociology class or something. Abraham Maslow in the 1940s established this pyramid to say that we all have human needs that must be satisfied in order to self-actualize, which is at the top of that pyramid. And safety is pretty close to the bottom. And at that time, he was referring to safety as having a roof over your head so that you could sleep comfortably and safely at night. Being able to walk down the street in your neighborhood without having to carry a weapon to defend yourself from a pickpocketer or something like that. But we've noticed in organizational life that this concept of safety has evolved into psychological safety. The reason I bring this up here is that we, as an individual communicator, have the opportunity to create psychological safety for our cohorts, for our peers, our colleagues, even up the chain, our managers, our senior executives. We create psychological safety for other people. When it's not created for us, then we behave in different ways. Some of us get quiet. Some of us might communicate a little more defensively. There's a lot of things that can come from not feeling safe in the workplace. There's this other principle that I love, and partly because I did improv back in those MTV days down in LA, but many of you are familiar with this idea of yes and as a guiding principle for how to communicate with your teams at work. The idea of yes and, if you're not familiar with it, is that you're always adding to somebody else's idea. So imagine for a moment that you are in a meeting and somebody, you contribute an idea. Maybe you're a little introverted, or maybe you have kind of a passive communication style, and it takes a lot for you to speak up. So you speak up and you propose this idea, and you get cut off at the pass. The person in the room, it could be your peer, it could be your manager, whoever it is, they say, yeah, but that won't work, or yeah, but no, we tried that before. The moment the word but enters the scene, the moment the word but enters the scene, as a human being, we immediately feel dismissed. It immediately feels like what we say didn't add value. And I'm going to give you two really simple statements that are tools for you if you're thinking, oh, okay, but I can't really jump on this yes and train. I want to give you two really simple communication statements if you are, a little resistant to this idea, that I think help demonstrate open-mindedness, humility, etc. And they also are just really cool, really great tools for civil discourse. So here it goes. Somebody says something to you and you really don't think maybe you don't think there's a lot of value to the idea, or maybe it throws you off, or you want to push back or whatever. You could say, I hadn't thought of it that way before. I hadn't thought of it that way before. Here's another one that I love. I think differently about that, and here's why. Notice the difference in the communication in terms of how somebody feels on the receiving end of a message like that. I want to pause here for a moment to bring up a theory that that I think is really important here, and I'm going to mention it again a little later. It's called nonviolent communication. NVC is the acronym. And the idea of nonviolent communication, and it's been around since the 60s, and it's very powerful, but it's about creating an environment for collaboration, and it's about being cooperative. So when we are yes-anding people, we are being cooperative, we are being open-minded, and we are creating a connection with them. Now, that doesn't mean that your solution is always going to be implemented. It doesn't mean that your idea is going to make it to the top 5. How are you treating people, though? And how do people feel about you when they leave the room? How do they talk about you? What is your personal brand? All of your communication shapes people's perceptions of you. It's a powerful thing. And I'm interested in getting your opinion. Now, some of you engineers are going to really not like this poll because there's no wrong answer. It's really about your perception. So the question is around, how valued do you feel at work? And I'm going to just push one suggestion out here. However you define value is fine. I do want to push you to think beyond monetary value. So if you're paid the big bucks, that's fantastic, and congratulations, and I mean that sincerely. I want you to think beyond that monetary value, though. How do you feel in terms of people acknowledging your ideas, validating concerns you might have, etc.? So I'm going to ask for Nikki's help in facilitating this poll.
Perfect. So you should see that poll on your screen at this point, and Janelle has pretty much explained what we're looking for with this particular poll question. So if you don't mind taking a quick moment to provide us with your response. And again, everybody is moving really fast, so you have about 3 seconds before I close this up. There you go. So it looks like close to 40% feel like they're in that mid-range.
Okay. Thank you so much for doing that. I appreciate that. So what that tells me, that informs me that there's room for improvement, right? There's room for organizational change, and we really can only make choices for ourselves, and we can make change in how we communicate, and that's really all that we have the power to do. And I'm going to come back to that, but thank you for sharing that. We're in the mid-range, so perhaps sometimes we're feeling valued by certain people and maybe sometimes not so much others. I just finished a project that I've been working on for several months, where I've been working with a team here where I live in Washington State. And this particular organization is having a lot of issues around perception of feeling valued, actually. And it boils down to people don't feel heard. So there is a lack of listening from the top down. There is a lack of listening from interdepartmental communication, and people feel like they're operating in silos. And one thing that came out of a class that I was facilitating the other day was, this simple and practical need for tools on how to listen. So we are going to look at that today. How do you acknowledge somebody's idea, even if you are not accepting it? How do you acknowledge the person that's sharing the idea? So we're going to come back to that in a moment. I want to share with you a little bit of research around trust and conflict. And this gentleman might look familiar to some of you. My colleague Stephanie Moore, who facilitated another fantastic webinar on behalf of Motivaim on effective meeting, she mentioned Patrick Lencioni. He's a thought leader in leadership and organizational life. And this particular book, he's written many, but this one is called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And what he discusses is that if there is a lack or an erosion of trust in an organization, then everything else above that becomes a lot more challenging to accomplish. So when there is trust, when that is established, then we can engage in effective conflict. When we can do that, we've got greater commitment, we can hold ourselves and others accountable, and ultimately we get results. With this organization I just mentioned in Washington State I've been working with, they said to me, and I heard this many times, they said, you know what, we get results. Don't you worry about that. We get results. We're really results oriented. That's not our problem. It's the journey to getting the results that are making people feel torn down, dismissed. There's people wanting to leave and look for other jobs, different careers, because there's so much dysfunction and so much devaluing going on. Well, I want to define conflict for a moment. So as I mentioned, I'm a certified mediator, and I'm going to give you an academic definition of conflict. So the researchers that define this, they wrote a book called Looking Out, Looking In, and their names are Adler and Proctor. And here's the definition of conflict. Conflict is an expressed struggle between two interdependent parties that perceive scarce resources. Now, resources could mean a lot of things. Resources could mean money, funding for a project. It could mean like physical space. That was an issue that came up the other day. We don't have physical space to meet face to face and talk with each other at work. It could be lack of good benefits. I mean, there's a lot of scarce resources. But really, what it boils down to is that there is a perception of scarce resources, and the parties involved in conflict are interdependent. And at the heart of conflict, it's really about solving problems, and the problems are really about people's needs not being met. So I'm going to share this data point with you from the World Economic Forum, who's already forecasting into 2020 that the number one skill that we need to have at work is solving complex problems. Well, you solve problems all day long, all of you do. And if I asked you to share what kinds of problems are you solving, you could give me a smattering of different problems that you're solving. If I asked you though, and this is just something for you to reflect on, if I asked you, what are some of the interpersonal problems at work that you face? What are you encountering at work, and how do you solve those? I'm curious what people would say, and I hear them all the time, so I'll share a few with you. Oh, I'm working with somebody who, shows up late every day to work. I'm working with a peer who's very unresponsive. They don't even get back to my emails for like 2 or more days. Very, very low, very slow to respond. Somebody else just the other day said to me, I'm working with someone who undercommits and who just always has a snarky attitude. There's a lot of interpersonal problems at work. Maybe you have a difficult time giving feedback or getting feedback from somebody. All of that's interpersonal. I want to share with you a little bit about what you would experience in the larger blown out curriculum for this course. So in the larger curriculum, we'll look at the 5 responses to conflict, the 5 approaches that people take to conflict. And I'll just highlight that if you have a tendency to flee conflict, then you're probably somebody who is considered avoidant, right? That's the person who, when you get in an argument with your significant other at home, you get in your car and you flee the scene, you go for a drive. It might be that you don't respond to an email for a few days. That's an avoidant approach or avoidant kind of response to conflict. If you are somebody who is at the other end of that continuum and you have more of a fight response to conflict, then maybe you're more adversarial. You're more of that competitive nature where there's always going to be a winner and there's always going to be a loser, and you're really of course always wanting to win. So very adversarial, very polarizing. Now, we're not going to go deep into that. What I do want to highlight today, though, are the 5 skills for collaboration. This is all about communicating in a way where we are finding opportunities to be cooperative with our peers and colleagues and our management and our executives, anyone we can. How can we be cooperative to have greater job satisfaction, better health, etc.? So here are the 5 skills, and the first one I just want to start with, and that is just stop. Just stop. So often we communicate the first thing that comes to our mind, right? We're responsive. It's the first response that we have, and that's not always the best version of ourselves, is it? I mean, I can say it's not for me, for sure. So there's a lot of strategies for people around, everybody's different, but just stopping, taking a deep belly breath, maybe 5, walking around the block, journaling. Maybe you need to eat something, because I know that when I get hangry, like, I need to take care of my blood sugar. But the first step is to stop. And the second is to listen. It is to listen. One of the most underrated communication skills and abilities, I think, of all. And here's why it's so important. There are countless obstacles, hurdles, challenges to listening well in the workplace, and also in our personal lives too, no doubt about that. Some of these terms that you're seeing on the screen may be unfamiliar. Some of them are a little bit, they might be academic sounding, but I want to point out the one 4th down on the list, that bullet point of pseudo listening, because we all learned how to do that really well, really early on, like in 1st grade. So if you're familiar with the cartoon Peanuts back in the day, Charlie Brown, all the kids were in class, wah, 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 and that was the sound that they perceived the teacher to be making, and they pretended to listen, right? We as adults do that. We do it in meetings. We nod our head, we might smile, and we pretend to listen. That's pseudo listening. My question to you is, what is the risk of ineffective listening? Just in the context of the workplace. I asked this of that group in Washington the other day, and I heard all sorts of things like, mistakes, right? Inefficiencies, hurt feelings. We lose the opportunity to learn from each other. Less innovation and creativity. Somebody else said, when we don't listen, we lose out on learning what some of our colleagues' strengths are that we could be leveraging for other projects, right? All of these real negative implications of not listening well to each other. I love this quote by Stephen Covey. If you're not familiar with Stephen Covey, he wrote a book called The 7 Habits of Successful People. And isn't it true? I mean, how often are you listening to figure out, how am I going to respond to this and sound cogent and logical and like I have a good retort? So often we're listening to not understand. So I want to talk today, just give you 2 simple active listening tools that you may already be using. And if you're not, you can start to experiment with them a little bit more. So the very first one is the idea of simply paraphrasing and acknowledging where somebody's at, right? Now imagine back, like put yourself back in the boardroom. You're at a meeting. You might be facilitating this meeting, or you might be attending this meeting. It doesn't really matter, but I want you to put yourself in that situation. And somebody in the room objects to something, or they ask a difficult question, and you notice that the emotion in that person is pretty escalated. There's an intense emotion happening, and you can tell that because of the volume of their voice and their facial expression. Maybe their body language is giving that off. And in the emotional intelligence vernacular, we call this moving into the red, right? That person might be a little bit uneasy or peeved, or they could be apprehensive, frightened, they could be panicked, they could even be up into the really top of that quadrant, and they might be enraged about something. So there's a whole host of angry or red emotions. It's not as simple as saying, oh, they're angry. There's a lot of different, there's a big realm of possibilities there. But clearly that person needs to be acknowledged. So this is a real simple example, but I want you to have a little language around this. When we paraphrase, not only what the person's issue is around, so like the content is around the deadline, right? That's the business issue. But what the person's emotional state is, when we call that out, you actually see in people, a lot of the time, you see their bodies relax. You see their nonverbal behavior. You see their shoulders drop. You see them take a deep breath. You hear the volume decrease. There is something that happens when somebody feels heard. There are a whole lot of words that I would advise we don't use, right? This is not about psychoanalyzing and telling people how they feel. So I specifically use the word concerned here because I think it's a neutral term. It's different than saying, wow, you sound, really angry about that, right? That people don't like to be told how they feel in those kind of specificities. So saying, you're concerned we won't meet our deadline, and acknowledging that that's where that person is. Here's another tool. So this is also active listening, but this is a slightly different scenario. So you have somebody in the room in that meeting who is clearly disappointed about something, right? They're more in what we would call the blue quadrant. So the blue is that they're drained, that they're a little exhausted, they're fatigued, they're discouraged, they're disappointed. And so there's not a lot of anger there, but there's certainly an opportunity for us as a listener to do some empathizing. And I want to be really clear that when we empathize with somebody, so you invested a lot of energy into that project, it doesn't mean we're agreeing with them. It means that we're stepping into their shoes and seeing it from their perspective. That's all that means. And we refer to this as the platinum rule, which is treat others how they want to be treated versus the golden rule, treat others how we would want to be treated. So it's being very other-centric when we're empathic. And empathy creates connection, as does acknowledging somebody where they're at and making them feel heard. So when we go back to these 5 skills for collaboration, and after we do that listening, and there's a lot more to say and a lot more tools to give you, but after we do that listening work, which is probably the hardest part, then we can move into asserting ourselves and helping other people assert themselves as well. So I want to define assertive communication. There are 4 different communication styles. Assertive communication really means I count and you count. It is win-win. I am willing to take the risks to get my needs met, and I also want to make sure that your needs are met as well. Now, when we are aggressive, we get our needs met at the other person's expense. We'll take anyone down and we're going to get our needs met. If we are passive, we're not willing to take the risk to get our own needs met. So we put others above us. And if we're passive aggressive, then we are communicating, I count, you don't count, but I'm not going to tell you that you don't count. So we act in passive aggressive ways. I'll give you one really simple example. We might leave somebody off of an email thread who really needs to be involved in that conversation. That would be considered passive aggressive behavior potentially, because you could say, oh, that was a mistake, I didn't mean to, that was unintentional, right? You could play that one off. What I want to point out here is when we are wanting to collaboratively problem solve, when we're wanting cooperation from the other person, when we're wanting to build and sustain those healthy relationships, we want to go for an assertive communication style. The first place to begin is to ask the question to ourselves, what is the outcome that I want to have as a result of communicating with this person? And I want to give you an example. And then I'm going to give you one more tool to take away today. So very frequently, I facilitate all day kinds of trainings, right? I go into different organizations and I do I do professional development, and I often get asked to go out afterwards with the group that I worked with. It's been an intensive 8 hours and they want to go have dinner or have drinks or whatever. And my outcome, my goal of the relationship I have with the client is to, of course, sustain that relationship. And I want to be their trusted advisor. And I really want to feed that relationship. But I am an ambivert. And if any of you out there are ambiverts, I bet you some of you are, many of you probably are, it means that your extroverted self has been on all day long, right? And for me, 8 hours of an intensive seminar where I'm doing a lot of listening and a lot of interacting, I am in my extroversion self. But because I give at the office, I give all of that, I really need to retreat into my introversion self, and I need to honor that. I need to replenish, and I need some quiet time and quiet space. And so it's really difficult for me to sustain my energy after a full day and go out with a client or a group of people. Even if I really, really enjoyed them, it's difficult for me. And part of being assertive in our work lives is being able to say no, being able to set clear personal boundaries that honor our core values and the things that we've already committed to for ourselves, right? Because when we are aligned with our values, then we feel happy and satisfied and all of that. Well, this is a model that I've been using a long time, and I want to share it with you today. And I encourage you to even think about something in your work world where you really do need to communicate a positive no. And this tree is to represent that positive no. So let me describe this for you. At the roots of the tree is your individual yes. This could be commitments that you've already said yes to. It could be your core values. So for me, like at the end of the day, I want to go home and have some time with my 4-year-old daughter and my husband. The yes is anything that is a need that you have, and needs are non-negotiable. The no at the heart of the tree is your no to that person's request, your coworker's request, whoever that is. And the yes up in the branches are the yes to the relationship of the person who is asking you for this favor, or they're inviting you to something. So for me, when I have to say no to a client about going out afterwards, it would sound something like this. Thank you so much for including me. I really appreciate it. I have plans with my family tonight for dinner, so I can't join you. I would really love to have coffee with you or go get a glass of wine sometime this month so that we can debrief and talk about what's working here. When are you available? Okay. That's a real simple example, but that's a positive no. I was coaching an engineer just last week at that Washington company I mentioned, and she said self-described. She said, I'm an introvert and I really like building relationships one-on-one or in small groups. And I keep getting invited to this company barbecue. And I really don't want to go. It's just not my jam, right? And she said, what do? I don't want to be perceived as, not a team player or that I'm isolating myself. And I said, okay, so what's your yes? And she said, well, my yes is outside of putting in, those 50 hours a week, I have other commitments and I would rather meet with people in smaller, one-on-one scenarios. I said, okay, great. I said, what's the no? She said, no to coming to the barbecue and yes to me asserting other opportunities to meet people, have lunch, have a cup of coffee, have a beer after work, and get to know my colleagues. This is a quote that I just love by Lou Holtz, famous ball player. Life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond to it. We always have an opportunity to respond in as our best selves. Now, is that easy? It's easier to say that than do it, of course, but it is possible, and it starts with being connected to ourself and understanding how our own self-awareness and our awareness of our self-concept really play a role in how others perceive us and how others feel about being around us. I think it's important to share a little bit about connecting with the appropriate channel of communication. So in the academic world, we call CMC, computer mediated communication, all these wonderful tools that we have to communicate. And my question to have you think about in your own lives, in your own positions at work, in your own expertise, what are the limitations of email and IM and texting? And some of you already are thinking, well, there's a lack of body language. There's a lack of tone of voice, right? Isn't there? Sure. Those things aren't there. I mean, sure, in a text message, you can add the emoticon, right? With the wink or, the smile or whatever it is. But there's so much misinterpretation that goes on when we're not face to face. And I'm not suggesting that you're going to be able to meet everybody face to face, but I do want to just point out how significant our body language shapes people's interpretations of what we're saying. And our tone of voice, 38%, that's pretty significant too. So in my mind, the next best thing to face is a phone call, because at least you can have the tone of voice. What's interesting though, is that I just had, in that training I was doing with the Washington company, I had a really, really interesting hybrid of 3 different generations under the same roof. So we had the baby boomers, we had the Gen Xers, which I'm a party of, and then we had the millennials, and all of them work at this company under the same roof. And what surprised me was that I had 2 participants, both of the millennial generation, speak up, and they said, don't call me. That is the rudest thing you can do at work when my head's down and I'm trying to meet a project deadline. Don't call me. They both agreed. They said, and I said, wow, tell me about that, because that, as a Gen Xer, I'd rather have someone pick up the phone and call me than always send me an electronic message. They said, don't call me, it's rude, it throws me off my game. And I said, is it that when you see a phone call, a voicemail, or the phone blinking, does it give you some anxiety that it must be like urgent? And I said, yeah, text me. Or they said, better yet, just do a drive-by. And I said, a drive-by? They said, yeah, just stop in, pop your head in person. That surprised me a little bit. Sometimes I think we get into this headspace, if we're not a millennial, where we think they don't like the face-to-face. And I'm here to say that this particular group were all about the face-to-face, but they weren't about the phone calls, which was really interesting. And I said, well, how do you inoculate against the phone calls? And they said, I unplug my phone at work. And it was interesting, because then I said, whoa, that's kind of passive aggressive if you're not letting your colleagues know that you prefer a text first or a drive-by. And they were like, oh, I never thought of it that way before. And I said, well, you need to assert, right? You need to assert. Here's how you can get a hold of me, what works for you, right? If you're being cooperative, if you're being collaborative. So to wrap things up, time goes by so fast, but to wrap things up, what I want to point out is that after in the larger curriculum, we would do a deeper dive into connection, and then we would move into curiosity and look at how do we ask profoundly powerful questions that draw out assertion in other people, where we can learn things quicker, we can be more efficient, and we can be curious. Because when we're in a curious state, like a detective, wow, do we learn a lot. It really requires an open mind, though. Part of curiosity also is to check our own perceptions, right? To really take accountability that we could be wrong, right? The way I interpret it is shaped by my perception, which is influenced by a host of variables, and I could be wrong. And when we come from a place of curiosity, we get clarity much easier. So clarity means so many things. What I would focus on in the larger curriculum is how do you give clear feedback to somebody where you own your observations and you speak of the facts and you actually gain people's involvement in behavioral change. When we take the accusatory, finger pointing, you blaming stuff out of our language, how does that bolster the healthy relationships that we so desire? And then lastly, we'll look at the ability to look beyond somebody's strong position and understand what lies beneath that. Because folks sometimes have really strong positions, and there's always an underpinning of an interest, which is an unmet need. So we will do some exploration around that. So I would love to have you join me for the 2 sessions that we're offering. The first is around cultivating a healthy work climate. The second is around engaging in healthy conflict, effective conflict for real change. And these 2 sessions will be offered August 26th and 27th from 11 to 12:50. These are live online sessions, and we're going to offer a 20% discount for the first 20 people who sign up. So really looking forward to taking your questions, and I'll pass it to Nikki.
Perfect. What an awesome job, Janelle. Thank you so much for sharing that information. I love it when our listeners can walk away with actual tools that they can implement within their workplace. So yes, we have had some questions come in, and I am trying to filter through. We have it looks like about 6 minutes or so before we need to wrap up. The first question that came through is, well, first, let me just remind everyone, if you joined late, if you have a question, just type that into the panel located to the right of your screen, and we'll take as many as time will allow. Asking about the replay. So yes, we will have this replay available within the next certainly 24 hours, and we will either include it in your final your thank you email that'll go out, or in a separate email. But nonetheless, we will populate that on our website and send that to you as a thank you for attending. All right, so some of these questions, I think you touched on this first one that came through, but it may be worth revisiting in more detail. It reads, how would you suggest communicating with aggressive employees?
That's a tough one, because when somebody's aggressive, it's difficult to not get wrapped up in the toxicity of that emotion. And so without knowing more about the scenario, what I would say again is just that first strategy of stopping and being really grounding yourself and going, okay, so getting curious. Why is this person aggressive? Is this because they haven't been heard, they haven't been acknowledged? Is it more of a makeup? Is this just their personality and it's been like this a long time? But I think the first step is just to stop and ask yourself some of these questions and get curious. And then also, and my second inclination would be to come from a place and push yourself on this, but come from a place of compassion, of empathy. What would I be experiencing if I were stepping into this person's shoes? What's happening for them? And I think practically speaking, it's about coming from a place of assertive communication yourself when you are communicating with them. So if you are noticing some, behavioral things like, whatever that person is, that person yells, or that person shows up late to work, or that person is, constantly argumentative. I think being able to use clear messaging, and there's a model that I love called I notice and I wonder. And the idea is to say, here's what I'm noticing. I've noticed that, you've been coming in late every day this week, and I'm wondering, right? The wonder is the interpretation. I wonder if something's changed at home. We need to revisit the time you start and the time you leave. But I think coming from a place of compassion, coming from a place of assertion, and really thinking about not meeting that person in the red, but using neutralizing language as much as possible, because a lot of times people will mirror what you give them from a communication perspective. If you're not defensive back, then it's hard for that person to sustain that kind of energy.
That's a great point. And it's interesting. As you were talking, it reminded me of a situation where there was an employee that some would categorize as being aggressive, and a approach, I don't know if it would work with everyone, but it certainly worked with this particular person, where one day I literally just told this person how it makes me feel when they get into that
Mm-hmm.
mode. And
Mm-hmm.
this person replied that, "Oh, I didn't even realize I do that. I didn't realize I was talking in a
Mm-hmm.
loud voice." So I'm just wondering, how many cases are you dealing with people who they aren't even self-aware of what they're doing?
Right. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, because I think, again, and that's why we start with this connection bucket, is the awareness of self, right? From the communications perspective, it's about having the self-awareness. And often when we are dealing with somebody like that, and we can use I statements and we can assert how their behavior is creating an environment where we feel, we don't feel safe, we feel intimidated, we feel anxious. And when we're able to speak our truth and take ownership for our interpretation, it's really interesting how sometimes there's this aha moment for the other person, like, oh, dang, I didn't even know. Right? I didn't even know. So yeah, I love that you brought that up. Thanks, Nikki.
Absolutely. All right. I tell you, such a good topic. I almost forget that I'm here on an official capacity. So, next question. Should personality profiles be a part of your recruiting process? And should
Mm,
these profiles change after hiring?
mm. They certainly can be. The limitations to personality profiles, from my perspective, and I like them. I like taking them, and I think they're all very interesting. So I'm not a hater at all, but um, I should say and, not but. And I think the limitations are that when we take a psychological assessment, and I've had this feedback from numerous people who I've coached, really our psychological and physiological state that we're in is going to influence how we answer some of the questions. So for example, if I'm hangry, and I use that example twice today, because when I get hangry, I am unpleasant. I am not the best version of myself. If I'm hungry, if I am feeling sick, if I have had an argument with my spouse, or if I'm, on the other end of that, if I'm having a particularly like awesome day, right? It's going to potentially skew the way we respond to the kinds of questions in a personality sort of profile. So that would be the only, I guess, cautionary tale I would say, is that somebody might answer it and they look one way on paper, and it's really, the recruiter is really going to get, I think that the genuine or more genuine version of that person in person, face to face, when they can ask behavioral questions, right? Tell me about a time when you had to resolve a conflict with a colleague. What did it look like? What happened? And I think that while certainly you can facilitate these kinds of profiles, I think not writing people off one way or the other based on that, but having the opportunity to actually get to know them in person and then tweaking it afterwards, I think is probably the fairest way to go.
Okay, thank you. Do, 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 do. All right. I was trying to see if I could lump some of these questions together. I know that we're really close to the top of the hour, so why don't we wrap up with this question? Regarding misinterpretations, do you
Mm,
have a solution for the situation when a team is international and the majority speaks not the native language, but some
mm,
patchy English instead, perhaps
mm,
with heavy
mhm,
accents, and also are a considerable part of the team is located offshore and communicates via
mm,
conference calls or questionable
mm.
quality. So when you have
Yes.
geography and language barriers
Yes.
thrown in as
Mhm.
factors, I'm sure that
Yeah.
makes things even more.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. So I think the most tactical tool I would give you right off is be very transparent and explicit about perception checking. So perception checking and paraphrasing are both communication tools where you would say something like, "I want to make sure that I understood correctly what you meant. Was it X? Is that right?" Ask, and it takes a little bit of vulnerability on your part because you could be wrong, and it takes some humility because you could be wrong. And guess what it does for everybody else that is observing that kind of communication, that you're modeling that kind of perception checking, it lets them know how much you care to get it right. It lets them know that you are really coming from a place of wanting clarity. And so I think that it's on the host of whatever, that host of the webinar, host of the meeting, to say, this is a global team, and not all of us share the same native language. Like, really putting that out there, like, let's call out the elephant in the room. So we're going to work really hard at ensuring that we're all understanding each other.
That is awesome. Thank you so much, Janelle. All right, so we are
My pleasure.
actually a minute or so over, so apologies for extending the time, but we do want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to participate in today's webinar. As I mentioned, we will send out a copy of the replay. If you didn't get a chance, you still have a few minutes to download the slides in the handout section to the right of your screen. So Janelle, we want to thank you for taking time to not only share this information, but prepare it. Like as I mentioned, a couple times I really felt like I was an attendee instead of it here in an official capacity. So great job with sharing this information. Also want to
Thank you
thank
so much.
Absolutely. Thanking MotivaimCoach as well for helping to supply rich content like Janelle. So we want to thank you as well for partnering with us on this four-part series. So today is part 3, and we will announce part 4 in the coming weeks. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.